The father's justice. My wife got pregnant, and the child wasn't mine. It was Tyler Reed's, the man I trusted enough to build a company with, the one who stood next to me, shaking my hand the day we signed everything. And when the truth finally surfaced, her family didn't ask what happened. They told me to be a man, to stay, to accept it, to raise a life that came from betrayal as if nothing had been broken. I'm Adam Walker, 40 years old, and until a few weeks ago, I believed that if you worked hard enough, if you showed up for your family, if you gave people your loyalty without hesitation, your home would stay intact. That morning, the house looked exactly the same. Sunlight cutting through the kitchen window, dust drifting slowly above the counter, the quiet hum of the refrigerator filling the space. Nothing was out of place, except everything was. Because somewhere inside those walls, between routine conversations and familiar footsteps, my marriage had already ended without me knowing. And the worst part wasn't just losing her. It was realizing I had been the only one still living in that version of our life. So the question wasn't what I had lost. It was how long it had been gone without me. Seeing it, a few months earlier, my life had a rhythm that felt solid, predictable in the best way. I was on the road more than I was home, flying out before sunrise, landing in unfamiliar cities, checking into quiet hotel rooms that all smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and recycled air. I was building something I believed would last, expanding our business into new markets, chasing contracts, taking meetings that stretched late into the evening under fluorescent lights. And back home, Tyler Reed was the one I trusted to hold everything together. We had started from nothing, just two guys working out of a cramped office with mismatched chairs, and over time, that turned into something real. I trusted him the way you trust someone who's seen you at your worst and still chose to stand next to you. There was no hesitation when I handed him control of the day-to-day. No second guessing. No need to check in twice. At home, Lauren Walker was still Lauren. She moved through the house with that same quiet ease, making coffee in the mornings, leaving a light on for me when I came back late, asking simple questions about my trips that felt genuine enough that I never thought to question them. We had our routines, small, ordinary things that don't stand out until they're gone. A message before bed, a quick call in between meetings, a reminder about groceries or a bill. Nothing dramatic, just steady. And that was the problem. Because when everything feels steady, you stop looking for cracks. You stop asking questions that don't seem necessary. You assume the people closest to you are exactly who they've always been, and that assumption becomes the one place you never think to protect. I wasn't careless. I was just certain that the man handling my business had my back, certain that the woman waiting at home was exactly who I thought she was. And somewhere in that certainty, without any warning, something had already started to shift, long before I ever noticed it. It happened on a morning that didn't feel any different from the others. The kind of quiet start where the house is still holding on to the night. The kitchen light was off, just a thin line of pale sunlight slipping through the blinds and stretching across the table. I walked in, set my keys down, reached for the coffee machine out of habit, and that's when I noticed it. Lauren's old phone was sitting near the edge of the counter, plugged in, screen dark, like something she had meant to grab before leaving the room. She had mentioned needing it for a backup the night before. Nothing unusual, just one of those small, forgettable details. I picked it up without thinking. The way you pick up anything that's been left out, intending to move it aside. The screen lit up immediately. No passcode, no hesitation. Just a soft glow in my hand, and then messages. At first, I didn't even process what I was looking at. A name at the top of the thread, Tyler. I remember pausing for a second, not because I was suspicious, but because it felt out of place in a way I couldn't explain. My thumb hovered over the screen, then moved almost on its own. The first message I opened didn't make sense. Not right away. It read like something incomplete, like I had walked into a conversation halfway through. I scrolled once, then again. The timestamps stretched back days, then weeks. The tone shifted as I read, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Words that didn't belong between a man and his business partner's wife. Small phrases that carried weight when you stopped and actually looked at them. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Something I wasn't seeing, context I was missing. I pulled out a chair and sat down slowly, the wood scraping faintly against the floor. The coffee machine beeped behind me, finished brewing, but I didn't move to pour it. I kept reading. Each message filled in a space the last one had opened, details aligning in a way that didn't leave room for interpretation. Times matched the days I had been out of town. Locations that seemed casual at first, then repeated enough to form a pattern. I noticed the way they spoke to each other, the familiarity, the ease. It wasn't new, it wasn't sudden. It had been there, building quietly, while everything on the surface stayed the same. At some point, I stopped scrolling and just stared at the screen, not because I was done, but because I couldn't make the next movement. The phone felt heavier in my hand than it should have. I looked around the kitchen, at the same counters, the same chairs, the same morning light, and none of it lined up with what I was holding. It didn't feel real. I went back to the top of the thread and read again, slower this time, as if reading it differently might change what it meant. But it didn't. Every message said exactly what it said, no matter how many times I looked. I tried to think of anything that could explain it away. A misunderstanding, a joke taken out of context, something that would pull it back into a shape I recognized. But every detail closed that door a little more. The dates, the tone, the consistency, it all pointed in one direction. I wasn't piecing together fragments. I was looking at something complete. The clock on the wall ticked quietly behind me. I don't know how long I sat there, just holding the phone, reading and rereading the same lines, waiting for something to shift. Upstairs, I could hear faint movement, footsteps, the start of another ordinary morning, and that was the moment it settled in, not all at once, but enough that I couldn't push it away anymore. I set the phone down on the table, screen still glowing, and for the first time, I realized I wasn't asking if something was wrong. I was trying to figure out how long it had been right in front of me, without me seeing it. It was a few days later when Lauren finally said she needed to talk. A Sunday evening. The kind where the house feels quieter than usual. The TV was on in the background, some game I had been following all week, but she walked over and muted it without asking. That alone felt out of place. She didn't sit right away, just stood there for a second, hands pressed together, eyes already red like she had been rehearsing this moment somewhere else. I stayed where I was, leaning back slightly, watching her take a breath she couldn't quite hold. "I made a mistake," she said, voice low, controlled at first, then breaking halfway through the sentence. "I need you to just listen before you say anything." I nodded once. There wasn't anything to interrupt. She started explaining. Pieces of the story I had already seen laid out in messages, but hearing them out loud gave them a different weight. She called it something that got out of hand, something she didn't plan. The words sounded practiced, like they had been arranged to land, softly, but they didn't change what they described. I let her speak without stopping her, without correcting anything, just watching the way she avoided looking directly at me for more than a second at a time. Then she paused, longer than before. Her hands tightened together, and when she spoke again, her voice dropped lower. "I'm pregnant." The room didn't shift, the light didn't change, nothing around us reacted, and that made it feel even more still. She kept going before I could say anything. "It's Tyler's." The words came out in one breath, like saying them quickly might make them easier to carry. I didn't respond right away. I just looked at her, noticing small things. The way she pressed her lips together after speaking, the way her shoulders pulled inward, like she was bracing for something. "How long have you known?" I asked. She blinked, just once, like the question hadn't been part of what she expected. "About 6 weeks," she said quietly. 6 weeks. I repeated it in my head, matching it against mornings, dinners, and short conversations in passing. 6 weeks of sitting across from me at the same table, asking what I wanted for dinner, reminding me about errands, talking about things that didn't matter, all while carrying something she had already decided not to tell me. I stood up slowly, not because I was angry, but because staying in the same position felt impossible. The chair moved back with a soft scrape. She started crying more openly then, stepping forward like she was about to reach for me, but stopping halfway. I didn't move toward her. I just stayed where I was, trying to place the version of her in front of me next to the version I thought I knew. They didn't line up anymore. What stayed with me wasn't just what she had done. It was how easily she had continued everything else. The mornings hadn't changed. The tone of her voice hadn't changed. The way she looked at me when she asked simple questions hadn't changed. It meant none of those things had ever required honesty to exist. They only needed routine. And somewhere inside that routine, she had been making the same decision over and over again, long before she ever stood in front of me and said the words out loud. I nodded once, more to end the moment than to respond to anything she had said. She kept talking, but I wasn't really hearing it anymore, because the only thing that mattered had already been said. And standing there, with everything finally spoken, I realized the conversation hadn't started because she couldn't lie anymore. It had started because she had run out of time. The days that followed didn't look like what most people expect. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no broken glass left on the floor as proof that something had shattered. The house stayed quiet, almost too quiet. I still came downstairs in the morning, still reached for the same coffee mug, still sat at the same spot at the table. Lauren moved through her routine like nothing had changed, pouring cereal, checking her phone, asking small questions that didn't require real answers. I responded the way I always had, short, steady, enough to keep everything moving. If someone had walked in, they wouldn't have seen anything unusual. That was the point. I didn't confront her again. I didn't bring it up during dinner or let it slip into conversation. Not because I didn't have questions, but because I already had answers. And once you have answers, repeating the conversation doesn't give you anything new. It just gives the other person space to reshape what already happened. I wasn't interested in that. I was watching instead. Small details started to stand out. The way she kept her phone closer than before. The slight pause before she answered certain questions. The way she avoided eye contact, just a fraction longer than usual. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to confirm that what I had seen hadn't been a misunderstanding. Every night, after she fell asleep, I would step outside and sit in my truck. The air was colder out there, even when the night wasn't particularly cold. I'd close the door without turning the engine on, let the darkness settle around me, and set a timer on my phone. 15 minutes. That was all I gave myself. 15 minutes to feel everything I didn't allow inside the house. The silence in that space was different, heavier, but honest. I'd sit there with my hands resting on the steering wheel, staring through the windshield at nothing in particular, letting the weight of it come through without trying to push it away. Then the timer would go off, a soft vibration against the console, and just like that, it stopped. I'd pick up the phone, turn off the alarm, take one slow breath, and step back out. The porch light would still be on, the house still exactly where I left it. I'd walk back inside, lock the door behind me, and return to the version of the night that required control instead of reaction. Because reacting in that moment, in that kind of noise, doesn't fix anything. It hands over whatever control you still have left. So I stayed quiet, I watched, I listened. I let everything settle into place without interfering. And somewhere in that silence, without anyone noticing, I started to realize that not reacting wasn't the same as doing nothing. It was the first move in something they didn't even know had already begun. They came over in the afternoon, not one at a time, but together, like this was something that needed an audience. I heard the front door open before I even stood up from the couch. Susan Hale walked in first, moving carefully, her expression already set into something calm and controlled. Kyle Hale followed right behind her, shoulders squared, scanning the room like he was stepping into a situation he already understood. Brenda Shaw came last, slower, glancing around like she was taking inventory of a space she had never really paid attention to before. No one asked if it was a good time. They just made their way inside and sat down as they belonged there. Susan folded her hands in her lap and leaned forward slightly. "Adam, this is difficult for everyone," she said, voice measured. almost rehearsed. But the child is innocent in all of this. I nodded once, not because I agreed with the direction of the conversation, but because I understood where she was trying to take it. She kept going, choosing her words carefully, framing everything in a way that avoided the part that actually mattered. It wasn't about what had been done. It was about how it looked, how it would be seen if it fell apart. Kyle didn't wait long before stepping in. He shifted forward in his chair, elbows resting on his knees, looking straight at me like he was about to explain something simple to someone who just hadn't thought it through. "You've got a choice here," he said. "You stay, you work through it, you step up. People respect that. That's what a real man does." He paused just long enough to let that settle. "But if you walk away, then you're just another guy who couldn't handle things when they got hard." The room stayed quiet after that. Brenda stopped moving. Susan didn't interrupt, and for a moment it felt like they were all waiting for me to react, to argue, to defend myself, to push back against something that had already been decided for me. I looked at each of them, one at a time, noticing small details. The way Susan avoided my eyes when the conversation got too close to the truth. The way Kyle leaned back slightly after speaking, as he had just made his point. The way Brenda shifted in her seat, but didn't say anything that actually mattered. "I hear you," I said finally, keeping my voice even. That was enough for them. Kyle nodded, satisfied, like the conversation had moved exactly where he expected it to go. Susan exhaled softly, her posture easing just a little. From the outside, it probably looked like I was considering what they were saying, like I was weighing it, giving it the time they thought it deserved. But inside, there was nothing left to decide. They weren't there for the truth. They weren't there to understand what had happened, or why. They were there to contain it, to keep everything from breaking in a way that would be visible to other people. And sitting there, listening to them talk about responsibility and image, I realized they weren't asking me to fix anything. They were asking me to carry it quietly so they wouldn't have to see it. Which left me with one question I hadn't said out loud yet. How long had they already decided what my role in this was supposed to be? I met Diane Mercer on a gray Tuesday morning in an office that looked exactly the way I needed it to look. Clean windows, no decoration that didn't belong there, a legal pad set squarely in front of her, two neat stacks of folders off to the side. She didn't waste time trying to comfort me. She let me sit down, let me explain the situation once. Then she took off the cap of her pen and said, "All right, now stop talking and start organizing." There was something steady in the way she said it that made the room feel different, smaller, clearer. I told her about Lauren, about Tyler Reed, about the pregnancy, about the business. She listened without interrupting, then began laying it out in a way that stripped the chaos off it piece by piece. First, stay calm, not for pride, not to look strong, but because panic makes people careless. Careless people delete the wrong thing, say the wrong thing, warn the other side without meaning to. Second, do not alert anyone. No speeches, no threats, no dramatic confrontations that give people time to clean up what they've done. Let them think the ground is still stable. Third, collect the financial picture. Bank accounts, credit card statements, tax records, payroll, business expenses, shared assets, anything tied to money. She said money leaves a trail even when people lie, and trails matter more than tears. Fourth, separate the marriage from the company. Those were two different problems, and if I treated them like one emotional mess, I would lose clarity on both. One involved betrayal inside a home. The other involved obligations, contracts, ownership, and misuse. They could overlap, but they had to be handled in separate folders, separate timelines, separate decisions. Fifth, follow evidence, not emotion. Diane tapped the edge of her pen against the legal pad when she said that, once, lightly. "You do not need to prove how hurt you are," she told me. "You need to prove what happened." So that's what I started doing. I went home and built order where there had been noise. One folder for personal records, one for joint finances, one for business accounts, one for communications and dates. I printed statements, highlighted charges, matched dates to trips, copied calendars, saved emails, and wrote down what belonged to the marriage and what belonged to the company. The more I sorted, the less lost I felt. Not better, not healed, just steadier. For the first time since everything cracked open, I wasn't standing in the middle of it, hoping to survive the fallout. I was stepping back far enough to see the whole structure. And once I saw the shape of it, I started to wonder what would happen when Tyler's name began showing up where it never should have been at all. I started with the numbers, because numbers don't hesitate or soften what they show. Late evenings turned into quiet sessions at the dining table, a single lamp casting a narrow circle of light over stacks of statements and receipts. I went line by line through the company card history, matching dates against our calendar, checking locations, and cross-referencing expense notes that had been filed under routine labels. At first, it looked ordinary. Small charges, spaced out, nothing that would trigger attention on its own. But then the pattern started to form. The same type of charge, the same time of day, the same cities that didn't match any client meeting we had ever scheduled. I marked them with a pen, one by one, the ink pressing a little deeper each time. Hotels that weren't tied to work, meals that didn't line up with any client list. It wasn't one mistake, it was repetition. I printed everything, laid the pages out side by side, aligning the dates with my travel schedule. When I was out of town, those charges appeared. When I was back, they disappeared. It was consistent enough that it didn't need interpretation. Tyler Reed hadn't just crossed a line inside my home. He had been using the business we built to support it. I gathered each instance, organized them into a clean sequence, and labeled them without exaggeration. Not accusations, just records. When I finished, there were 22 entries that didn't belong where they were. The next step wasn't emotional. It was structural. I went back to the partnership agreement, the one we had signed years earlier, when everything still felt balanced. The document was thicker than I remembered, pages filled with language that had seemed unnecessary at the time. I read it slower now, scanning each section until I reached the clause Victor Lane had insisted on including. It was buried deep enough that most people would never look twice, but it was clear once you found it. Any misuse of company assets for personal conduct that violated fiduciary responsibility gave the non-offending partner the right to initiate immediate dissolution, with priority control over intellectual property, client contracts, and operational assets. I read it again, just to make sure nothing about it could be interpreted differently. It couldn't. I didn't call Tyler. I didn't give him a chance to explain or reshape what had already been documented. I worked with Diane to prepare the notice, precise language, attached records, no gaps for confusion. On a Thursday morning, both copies were sent at the same time, one to the office, one to his home address. No warning, no discussion beforehand. Just a document arriving like any other piece of mail, except it carried everything he hadn't expected to face. The response came quickly. Missed calls lighting up my phone, a message asking to talk, to fix it, to not blow everything up. I didn't answer. There wasn't anything left to discuss. The agreement had already decided the outcome. I was just following it through. Under those terms, I retained control of the work itself, the designs, the contracts, the client relationships that had been built through years of direct contact. Tyler kept the name, the shell, that didn't carry the weight of what actually mattered. A few days later, I met Megan Ross at a small cafe near the office. She sat across from me, hands wrapped around a cup she hadn't touched, looking at me like she already knew what she was about to hear. "Are you starting over?" she asked. I nodded once. She didn't hesitate. "Then I'm coming with you." Caleb Foster made the same decision. Simpler, a short conversation, a single confirmation, no need for anything more. They had seen enough from their side of the room to understand where things had shifted. Within a week, the structure had changed completely. Clients I had worked with directly followed without resistance, not because of contracts, but because of trust that had been built over time. Files moved, systems reset, a new framework started taking shape quietly, without announcement. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The shift happened through actions that didn't require explanation. And somewhere in the middle of that transition, as everything settled into its new alignment, I found myself looking at the final set of documents one more time, not to check them, but to understand the full weight of what they represented, because what Tyler had done wasn't just personal anymore. It had left a trail that had rewritten everything we built, and I couldn't help but wonder if he had ever realized how much of it was tied to something as simple as a single line item on a statement. I didn't bring it back to their living room. I didn't gather everyone again or turn it into another discussion where voices overlap and nothing actually changes. I met them one at a time. Susan Hale first, a quiet coffee shop on a weekday morning, the kind of place where conversations stay low and no one pays attention to the table next to them. I arrived early, chose a seat by the window where the light fell evenly across the table, and placed the folder in front of me without opening it. When she sat down, she tried to start with something polite, something neutral, but I didn't follow it. I slid the folder toward her and said, "Just take a look." She opened it slowly, not defensive, just unsure. Page after page, dates highlighted, charges listed, locations marked clearly. I didn't explain everything at once. I pointed to one line, then another. "This weekend," I said quietly, tapping the page, "is when Lauren told you she was visiting a friend." She leaned closer, reading the details again, her expression tightening in small, controlled ways. "This charge is from a hotel, same date." I let the silence sit. No pressure, no raised voice, just information placed exactly where it needed to be. When she looked up, there was no argument waiting, just a shift, subtle, but real. Kyle Hale was different. He chose a place that felt louder, more open, like he expected the setting to give him space to push back. He started talking before I even sat down, trying to frame it again as something complicated, something that could still be worked through. I didn't interrupt. I let him finish, then placed the same folder between us. "Read it," I said. He hesitated for a second, then flipped it open. The first few pages didn't slow him down, but somewhere around the third, his pace changed. His eyes stayed on one line longer than the rest, then another. He didn't say anything. I leaned forward just enough to meet his line of sight when he finally looked up. "You told me I'd be walking away from my family," I said, keeping my tone even. "Just take a second and decide who stepped away first." He didn't answer. There wasn't anything left to argue with. Not when everything was laid out in front of him without distortion. I didn't call Brenda Shaw in for a meeting. A short phone call was enough. I explained it once clearly. No extra detail, no emotion layered over it. She reacted the way she always did. A few quiet exclamations, a pause, then less certainty than before. It didn't matter. She wasn't the one holding anything together. After that, I stepped back. I didn't follow up, didn't ask what they thought, didn't try to guide their reactions. The information was already in their hands. And when people finally see something without the version they've been told, it changes the way they stand behind it. Lauren stopped calling me, started reaching out to them instead. Conversations shifted, tone changed, and support wasn't as immediate as it had been before. It wasn't loud, but it was there, the space around her narrowing in ways she hadn't expected. I didn't need them to agree with me. I didn't need apologies or explanations. I just needed them to see what they had been defending without fully understanding it. Because once they did, the question wasn't whether they had been wrong, it was how they were going to respond now that they couldn't unsee it. The divorce was finalized on a quiet morning that didn't feel like an ending. Just a line being drawn exactly where it should have been from the start. I walked out of the building with a thin stack of papers in my hand, the weight of them lighter than I expected. No raised voices, no last-minute arguments, just signatures placed in the right spaces, and everything that followed becoming official. The air outside felt colder than it had any right to be, but it was clean, clear, in a way the inside of that house hadn't been for a long time. I didn't go back to what was left behind. Instead, I stepped into something I had already started building, my own company, under my own name. A small office at first, nothing impressive, just a desk near the window, a chair that didn't quite match, and a whiteboard leaning against the wall waiting to be filled. The first morning there, Sunlight came in at an angle that cut across the empty space, catching dust in the air the same way it used to in my kitchen. But it didn't feel the same. This space didn't carry anything hidden. Everything in it belonged to what I chose to build next. Clients reached out without hesitation. Some sent short emails, a few lines, direct and simple. Others called, asking where to send files and when we could start again. They didn't follow a company name. They followed the work, the consistency, the trust that had been built over time. Megan Ross was there on the second day, setting up systems before I even asked. Caleb Foster arrived with a box of equipment and started working like nothing had ever been interrupted. There was no need to explain everything. They understood enough to move forward. Lauren Walker and Tyler Reed stayed where they had chosen to stand. I didn't watch, didn't track what they did next, but the outcome wasn't difficult to imagine. When something is built on what has to be hidden, it changes the moment it's exposed. The structure doesn't hold the same way. The weight shifts, and whatever was holding it together quietly starts to give. They made their decisions, and everything that came with those decisions stayed with them. The only part of that situation I don't attach anything to is the child. Luke Reed didn't choose any of it. He didn't create the circumstances around him, didn't decide who his parents would be or how their story would unfold. Whatever else happened, he remained separate from it. That matters. It always should. What I took from all of this didn't come from one moment. It came from seeing how everything connects when it's stripped down to what's real. Trust is the most valuable thing you hand to another person, not because it feels good, but because it shapes every decision you make after you give it. Money can build something that looks stable, a house, a business, a life that appears complete from the outside. But it doesn't hold character in place. It doesn't correct choices made in private. And family. Family isn't meant to be a place where someone is expected to carry what's wrong just to keep things from looking broken. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't fight for something that had already been decided without me. I chose where to stand, and then I moved forward from there, one step at a time, without dragging anything behind me that didn't belong anymore. The quiet that followed wasn't empty, it was mine. If this story reached you in a way that feels familiar, take a second and let me know. You can leave a comment, share your perspective, or follow along if you want to hear more stories like this. I'm always interested in how other people see moments like these, because not everyone chooses the same path. Some walk away immediately, some stay and try to rebuild, and some, like me, wait until everything is clear before making a move. So I'll leave you with this. If you were standing in that same place, holding the same truth in your hands, would you leave the moment you saw it, or would you stay quiet long enough to make sure the ending was entirely yours?